In the small, dusty town of Redemption Ridge, life moved at a slow pace. The sun hung low in the sky most days, casting long shadows over the wooden buildings and dirt roads. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, where gossip traveled faster than a horse on open plains. But for one woman, this quiet little town had become her sanctuary. Her name was Esha, and she wasn't like anyone else in Redemption Ridge. She stood out in more ways than one. With her dark skin and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through people, she carried herself with a confidence that made folks sit up and take notice. Ishi ran the only bookstore in town, a tiny shop tucked between the saloon and the general store. Her shelves were lined with books of all kinds: adventure stories, poetry, history, even cookbooks. Folks often joked that if you couldn't find what you were looking for in Eshi's shop, maybe you didn't need it after all. But there was more to Eshi than met the eye. She kept her past close to her chest, never speaking much about where she came from or how she ended up in Redemption Ridge. Some said she'd wandered into town years ago, weary and worn, carrying nothing but a satchel full of books and a determination to start over. Others whispered that she'd once been caught up in something dangerous, that she'd left behind a life filled with trouble. Whatever the truth was, no one dared ask too many questions. Not when Ishi's piercing gaze could silence even the nosiest busybody. What the townsfolk didn't know was that Ishi owed her second chance at life to someone very special. A man who'd saved her when she thought all hope was lost. Years ago, before settling in Redemption Ridge, Ishi had found herself cornered by a group of ruthless bandits while traveling alone. Just as things looked their bleakest, a stranger appeared, out of nowhere. He was tall and lean, with a face weathered by time and eyes that burned like coals. His twin revolvers gleamed under the moonlight as he stepped forward, challenging the bandits without hesitation. That stranger was a gunslinger, though not just any gunslinger. His name carried weight across the territories, spoken in hushed tones by those who knew better than to cross him. After chasing off the bandits, he helped Ishi get back on her feet. Over time, their paths crossed again and again, until an unspoken bond formed between them. They weren't lovers, not exactly, but there was something deeper than friendship tying them together. Still, neither of them ever put words to it. Life was complicated enough without adding labels to the mix. For now, Eshi was content running her bookstore and living peacefully in Redemption Ridge. Or so she thought. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eshi locked up her shop and prepared to head home. She carried a stack of books under one arm, planning to spend the night curled up by the fire with a good story. The streets were empty, save for the occasional tumbleweed rolling lazily along. It was peaceful. Too peaceful, as it turned out, as she turned down a narrow alleyway shortcut, she heard faint footsteps behind her. At first, she dismissed them as nothing more than the wind playing tricks. But then she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. 3 shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, blocking her path. Before she could react, one of them lunged forward, grabbing her roughly by the arm. A rough sack was pulled over her head, muffling her cries as she struggled against their grip. Panic surged through her, but as she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't fight them. Not here, not like this. Whoever these men were, they clearly meant business. As they dragged her toward a waiting wagon, Eshi's mind raced. Who were they? What did they want with her? And why now, after all these years? Little did her kidnappers know, Eshi wasn't just any woman. She had ties to someone powerful, someone who wouldn't hesitate to burn the world down to get her back. Back in Redemption Ridge, a storm was brewing. When the gunslinger discovered what had happened, there would be no stopping him. And the men who had taken Eshi? Well, let's just say they were about to learn the hard way that some lines should never be crossed. The next morning, the town of Redemption Ridge woke up to the usual hum of activity. Horses clattered along the dirt roads, shopkeepers unlocked their doors, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. The bookstore, usually bustling with customers by this time, remained eerily quiet. Its door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. It didn't take long for people to notice something. was off. A few curious neighbors peeked inside, only to find shelves untouched but no sign of Esha. Her favorite chair sat empty near the fireplace, a cup of tea still resting on the small table beside it, cold and forgotten. Folks exchanged worried glances. This wasn't like her. Eshe was as dependable as the sunrise. She never missed a day at the shop without letting someone know. Word spread quickly through the town. Whispers turned into outright concern as people began piecing together what little they knew. Someone mentioned seeing Eshe leave the shop late the previous evening. Another recalled hearing strange noises coming from the alleyway around the same time. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered outside the bookstore, speculating about what might have happened. Some suggested she'd left on her own accord, though no one could imagine why. Others feared foul play. Then came the note, a single piece of torn paper pinned to the counter with a rusty nail. It was short, crude, and written in jagged handwriting. "We've got her. Stay out of this if you know what's good for you." There was no signature, no demand for money or favors, just a chilling warning meant to intimidate anyone who dared interfere. Whoever wrote it hadn't even bothered to hide their arrogance. For most of the townsfolk, the note was enough to send them scattering back to their homes, muttering prayers under their breath. But not everyone was willing to let fear dictate their actions. Among those who stayed behind was a man whose arrival would change everything. He rode into Redemption Ridge just as the sun reached its peak, casting sharp shadows across the dusty streets. His presence alone commanded attention. Tall and lean, with a weathered duster coat flapping against his legs and twin revolvers strapped low on his hips, he looked every bit the gunslinger legends were made of. His face bore the marks of a hard life, deep lines etched into his skin, eyes that held both wisdom and weariness. But there was an intensity about him that couldn't be ignored. He moved with purpose, scanning the faces of the townspeople before dismounting his horse with practiced ease. This was the man Eshe had once called a savior, the man who now stood frozen as he read the ransom note. His jaw tightened, hands curling into fists at his sides. Anyone watching could see the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't just another job for him. This was personal. Ezra Kane had come to Redemption Ridge expecting a quiet visit, hoping to spend some time with Eshe after weeks apart. They may not have put labels on their relationship, but Ezra cared for her more deeply than he cared to admit, even to himself. Now standing in her empty bookstore, staring at the evidence of her abduction, he felt a rage unlike anything he'd ever known. It burned hot and steady, fueling every thought, every movement. Without saying a word, Ezra stepped outside and mounted his horse. The townsfolk watched silently as he adjusted his hat and kicked his heels into the animal's sides, urging it forward. He didn't need directions to start tracking whoever had taken Eshe. Years of experience had taught him how to read the land like a map. Broken twigs, faint footprints in the dirt, discarded cigarette butts, all of these told a story, and Ezra was an expert at deciphering such tales. As he rode out of town, memories flooded his mind. He remembered the first time he'd met Isha, how she'd stood her ground despite being surrounded by danger. She wasn't the kind of woman who begged for help or waited to be rescued. No, Eshe was strong, smart, and resourceful. That was part of what drew him to her. But right now she needed him, and Ezra intended to make sure she got exactly that. The trail led him away from Redemption Ridge, toward the rugged wilderness beyond. The further he went, the angrier he became. These men had made a grave mistake by taking Eshe. They thought they were dealing with an ordinary woman, someone easy to intimidate. What they didn't realize was that they weren't just crossing Eshe, they were crossing him. And when Ezra Kane set his sights on something, or someone, nothing stood in his way. By late afternoon, Ezra had pieced together enough clues to narrow down the kidnapper's location. Somewhere deep in the woods, hidden among the trees and rocks, lay their hideout. As he pressed on, his thoughts drifted to Eshe. Was she hurt? Scared? Angry? Knowing her, she was probably using her wits to keep herself alive until he arrived. That thought brought a flicker of relief. though it did little to quell the fire raging inside him. Nightfall approached quickly, painting the sky in shades of purple and black. Ezra pushed his horse harder, ignoring the fatigue creeping into his muscles. Every second counted. He couldn't afford to waste time, not when Eshi's life hung in the balance. Up ahead, the trees grew thicker, forming a natural barrier that shielded whatever lay beyond. Ezra slowed his pace, listening intently for any signs of movement. The air was heavy with tension, each rustle of leaves sending his instincts into overdrive. Finally, he spotted it. A cabin nestled deep within the forest, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. Light spilled out through cracks in the wooden walls, illuminating the surrounding area. Ezra dismounted quietly, tying his horse to a nearby tree. He checked his revolvers, ensuring they were loaded and ready. Then, with silent determination, he crept closer, his heart pounding in anticipation. Whoever had taken Eshi was about to learn a painful lesson. You don't mess with someone who belongs to Ezra Kane. The cabin sat like a dark shadow in the middle of nowhere, its wooden walls weathered and cracked from years of neglect. Smoke curled lazily out of the chimney, blending with the cool night air. Ezra crouched low behind a cluster of bushes, his eyes scanning every detail. The faint glow of lantern light seeped through the cracks in the walls, casting jagged patterns on the ground. He could hear muffled voices inside, rough, careless words exchanged between men who clearly didn't expect trouble. Ezra's hand rested on the grip of one of his revolvers as he moved silently closer. Every step was deliberate, his boots barely making a sound against the soft earth. Decades of surviving in the wild had taught him how to move like a ghost, unseen and unheard. But tonight, it wasn't just skill guiding him. It was something deeper. It was the thought of her, sitting somewhere inside that cabin, scared but too stubborn to show it. Eshi wasn't the kind of woman who'd beg for mercy or cry for help. She'd fight back in her own way, using her sharp mind and sharper tongue until she found a way out, or until someone came for her, and that someone was here now. As Ezra crept closer, he caught glimpses of movement through the gaps in the cabin's walls. There were 3 of them, 3 men who had made the biggest mistake of their lives. One stood near the door, leaning casually against the frame with a rifle slung over his shoulder. Another paced back and forth, muttering under his breath while occasionally glancing at the corner of the room where Eshi sat tied to a chair. The third man, the leader, Ezra guessed, was sprawled across a rickety table, boots propped up and a bottle of whiskey in hand. They looked relaxed, almost bored, like they didn't have a care in the world, but Ezra knew better. Men like these always had tells, little signs that gave away their weaknesses. The guy by the door kept shifting his weight, like he couldn't get comfortable. The pacer had sweat running down his face despite the chilly night air, a clear sign of nerves. And the leader? He drank too fast, his hands trembling slightly as he brought the bottle to his lips. These weren't seasoned criminals. They were amateurs playing at being tough guys. That realization only fueled Ezra's resolve. If anything happened to Eshi because of their incompetence, there would be no forgiveness. Inside the cabin, Eshi sat perfectly still, her wrists bound tightly behind the chair. Her heart raced, but she refused to let fear take control. Instead, she focused on listening, on picking up every word, every tone, every shift in the room. She'd already figured out which of the men was in charge, the loudmouth with the whiskey bottle. His name was Jed, though his companions mostly called him Boss. He barked orders like he owned the place, though his confidence seemed forced, like he was trying too hard to convince everyone, including himself, that he was in charge. As she watched him closely, noting the way his eyes darted around the room whenever one of his men spoke, he was nervous, maybe even scared, though he hid it well behind bluster and bravado. She decided to use that against him. When Jed finally turned his attention to her, she met his gaze head-on, refusing to look away. "You picked the wrong person to mess with," she said, her voice steady despite the knot of dread twisting in her stomach. Jed laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the cabin walls. "Oh yeah, and why's that?" As she tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but piercing. Because you don't know who you're dealing with. For a moment, Jed hesitated. Then he smirked, dismissing her words with a wave of his hand. Big talk for someone tied to a chair? Don't worry, we'll get what we want soon enough. Eshe didn't respond. She didn't need to. Deep down, she knew Ezra was coming. She didn't know how or when, but she trusted him completely. In the meantime, she'd do whatever it took to stay alive, and maybe even throw these fools off balance while she waited. Outside, Ezra was closing in. He slipped around the side of the cabin, keeping to the shadows. The first target was easy, the man by the door. Ezra moved quickly, pressing a hand over the man's mouth before he could make a sound. A single, swift motion sent him crumpling to the ground, unconscious but alive. Ezra dragged the body out of sight, then turned his attention to the next, guard. This one was pacing near a window, his rifle dangling loosely from his fingers. Ezra stepped out of the darkness, his revolver trained squarely on the man's chest. Drop it, Ezra said, his voice low and cold. The man froze, his eyes wide with terror. For a second it looked like he might try to resist, but then reason kicked in. He dropped the rifle and raised his hand slowly, surrendering without a fight. Ezra knocked him out with the butt of his gun and moved on, leaving him sprawled on the ground. Now there was just one left, Jed, the self-proclaimed leader. Ezra paused outside the cabin door, listening carefully. Inside, Jed was ranting about how much money they'd get once they delivered Ishi to whoever had hired them. He sounded drunk, his words slurred and disjointed. Ezra allowed himself a small, grim smile. Drunk men were predictable. Predictable men were easy to deal with. With a deep breath, Ezra pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room fell silent, as all eyes turned to him. Jed stared, his mouth hanging open in shock. Eshe, however, didn't look surprised at all. Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, though she kept her expression neutral. Well, well, Ezra drawled, his voice dripping with menace. Looks like I found exactly what I was looking for. Jed scrambled to his feet, grabbing the whiskey bottle like it was a weapon. Who the hell are you? He demanded, his voice shaking. Ezra ignored the question. His focus was entirely on Eshe. He locked eyes with her for a brief moment, silently asking if she was okay. She gave the tiniest nod in response, and that was all the confirmation he needed. Here's how this is gonna go, Ezra said, stepping farther into the room. You're going to untie her, then you're going to walk out that door and never come back. Or... He raised his revolver, aiming it squarely at Jed's chest. We can do this the hard way. Jed's face twisted in anger, but there was fear in his eyes too. He glanced at his remaining companion, who looked ready to bolt at any second. You think you can just waltz in here and... The crack of Ezra's gun cut him off. The bullet tore through the table next to Jed, splintering the wood and sending shards flying. Jed jumped back, dropping the bottle in the process. It shattered on the floor, spilling whiskey everywhere. I don't miss twice, Ezra said, his tone ice cold. Untie her. Now. For a moment, no one moved. Then, realizing resistance was futile, Jed hurried over to Eshe and fumbled with the ropes binding her wrists. Ezra kept his gun trained on him the entire time, watching his every move. When the ropes finally fell away, Eshe stood up slowly, rubbing her sore wrists. She shot Jed a look so sharp it could have cut glass. You're lucky he showed up, she said, her voice laced with venom. Otherwise, you'd be dead already. Jed backed away, raising his hands in surrender. All right, we're leaving, just don't shoot. Without another word, he and his last henchman bolted out the door, disappearing into the night. Ezra lowered his gun but didn't holster it just yet. He scanned the room one final time, ensuring they were truly alone. Only then did he turn to Eshe, his expression softening ever so slightly. You okay? He asked, his voice quieter now. Eshe nodded, though her hands were still trembling. I'm fine, thanks to you. Ezra stepped closer, reaching out to steady her. Let's get out of here, As they walked out of the cabin together, the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. Eshe glanced at Ezra, noticing the tension still etched into his features. She wanted to say something, to thank him properly, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply reached out and touched his arm, letting him know she was grateful. They mounted Ezra's horse and rode away from the cabin, putting as much distance between themselves and danger as possible. Behind them, the forest loomed, dark and silent, hiding secrets neither of them cared to uncover. Ahead lay Redemption Ridge, and a future neither of them could predict. But for now they had each other, and sometimes that was enough. The ride back to Redemption Ridge was quiet, but it wasn't the kind of silence that felt heavy or awkward. It was the kind that came after a storm, when the worst had passed, and all that remained was the slow process of picking up the pieces. Eshe sat behind Ezra on his horse, her arms wrapped loosely around his waist for balance. The steady rhythm of the horse's hooves against the dirt road helped calm her racing thoughts. Though she couldn't shake the tension still coiled in her body, she kept replaying the events of the night in her mind, the fear, the anger, the relief. And each time she found herself glancing at Ezra's back, marveling at how he'd shown up just when she needed him most. For his part, Ezra didn't say much. He focused on guiding the horse through the dark, winding trails, his posture stiff and alert. Every now and then he'd glance over his shoulder to check on Eshe, his eyes softening slightly when he saw her holding on. He wanted to ask her if she was really okay, not just physically but emotionally, but the words stuck in his throat. Ezra wasn't the type to talk about feelings easily. Still, he could feel the weight of what had happened hanging between them, unspoken, but undeniable. When they finally reached the outskirts of Redemption Ridge, the first light of dawn was beginning to paint the horizon in shades of pink and gold. The town looked peaceful from a distance, its wooden buildings bathed in the early morning glow. But neither Ezra nor Eshe felt any sense of calm. They both knew the danger wasn't entirely behind them. Whoever had hired those men might still be out there, watching, waiting. And even if they weren't, the scars left by the kidnapping wouldn't heal overnight. As they rode into town, people began to notice their arrival. Word had spread quickly about Eshe's disappearance, and many of the townsfolk had stayed up late into the night, worrying and speculating. Now seeing her return with Ezra brought a mix of relief and curiosity. Some folks stepped out of their homes or shops, calling out greetings and questions, but Ezra ignored them all. His only priority was getting Eshe somewhere safe. He led the horse straight to her bookstore, tying it up outside before helping her down. Eshe winced slightly as her feet touched the ground. Her legs were stiff from the long ride and her wrists still ached from the ropes. Ezra noticed and immediately reached out to steady her, his hand firm but gentle on her arm. "Take it slow," he said, his voice low and gruff but tinged with concern. Eshe nodded, leaning into him for support as they made their way inside. The shop was exactly as they'd left it, untouched save for the ransom note still pinned to the counter. Eshe walked over and yanked it off, crumpling it into a tight ball before tossing it into the fireplace. Watching the paper burn felt cathartic, like she was erasing the memory of those men and their threats one tiny ember at a time. Ezra stood by the door, scanning the room as if expecting trouble to burst in at any moment. When he finally turned back to Eshe, he saw her sitting in her favorite chair near the fire, staring blankly at the flames. Her face was pale, her expression distant. For the first time since rescuing her, Ezra allowed himself to fully take in how fragile she looked. She always carried herself with such strength and confidence, but right now she seemed smaller somehow, as if the ordeal had chipped away at pieces of her armor. "You should rest," he said, breaking the silence. "I'll stay here and keep watch." Eshe shook her head, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine, really, I don't need babysitting." "I'm not leaving," Ezra replied firmly. There was no room for argument in his tone. "Not tonight." She opened her mouth to protest, but something in his gaze stopped her. It wasn't just determination, it was protectiveness, raw and unwavering. Eshe sighed, realizing there was no point in fighting him on this. Besides, deep down, she didn't want him to leave. Knowing he was nearby gave her a sense of security she hadn't realized she needed. "Fine," she muttered, leaning back in her chair. "But don't hover. I'm not an invalid." Ezra smirked faintly, though the humor didn't reach his eyes. Wouldn't dream of it. Later that day, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, news of Esh's rescue spread throughout Redemption Ridge. People gathered outside the bookstore, eager to see her and hear her story. Ezra stationed himself by the door, acting as a silent barrier between Eshe and the crowd. He didn't trust anyone, not yet. Even friendly faces could hide dangerous intentions, and he wasn't about to let his guard down until he was absolutely sure the threat was gone. Inside, Eshe greeted the curious visitors with forced cheerfulness, answering their questions as vaguely as possible. She didn't want to relive the nightmare any more than necessary, especially not in front of an audience. Still, some details slipped out. How the kidnappers had ambushed her, how they dragged her to a cabin in the woods, and how Ezra had shown up just in time to save her. The townsfolk listened intently, their expressions ranging from awe to disbelief. "He really took down 3 men all by himself?" one elderly woman asked, her voice filled with admiration. Eshe glanced at Ezra, who stood silently in the corner, arms crossed and hat pulled low over his face. "He did," she confirmed, her tone matter-of-fact. "And believe me, you don't want to cross him." That statement earned a few nervous chuckles, but no one dared argue. Ezra's reputation preceded him, and the sight of him standing there radiating quiet menace only reinforced the legends they'd heard. By mid-afternoon, the stream of visitors began to thin out, giving Eshe a chance to breathe. She closed the shop's door and locked it, turning the sign to closed. Then she sank onto the couch, rubbing her temples wearily. "You didn't have to do that," Ezra said, nodding toward the door. "You could have told them to leave sooner." Eshe shrugged. "They meant well. Besides, it's better they hear the truth from me than make up their own stories." Ezra didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved to sit across from her, his elbows resting on his knees as he leaned forward. "Still, you shouldn't push yourself too hard. Not after everything that's happened." Eshe looked at him, studying his face. There was something different about him today. Something softer, almost vulnerable. It was strange to see him, like this, so unguarded. Normally, he wore his emotions like armor, keeping everyone at arm's length. But now, sitting here in her shop, he seemed almost human. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ezra blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in her tone. "For what?" "For coming for me. For saving my life." He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "It's what I do." "No," Eshe said firmly, shaking her head. "Don't brush it off like that. What you did. It wasn't just what you do. You risked your life for me. You put yourself in harm's way because—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "Because you care." Ezra didn't deny it. He couldn't. Instead, he let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I care. More than I probably should." Eshe smiled faintly, though there was sadness in her eyes. "Well, whether you like it or not, you're stuck with me now." Ezra raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement flickering in his expression. "Is that supposed to be a threat?" "Take it however you want," she shot back, her tone teasing despite the heaviness of the moment. "But seriously, thank you, I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," Ezra replied, his voice soft but resolute. "Just promise me you'll be careful from now on." Eshe nodded, her smile widening slightly. "Deal." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared experience settling between them. Neither of them spoke, but the quiet was comfortable now. A reminder that they'd face the darkness together and come out stronger on the other side. Outside, the world continued to spin. Life in Redemption Ridge went on as usual, oblivious to the battles fought and won within the walls of a tiny bookstore. But for Eshe and Ezra, nothing would ever be the same again. They'd been tested, pushed to their limits, and emerged changed, but not broken. Together, they had proven that even in the face of danger, trust, and courage could light the way forward. And as the sun dipped below the horizon once more, casting the town in shadows, they knew one thing for certain. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. The days that followed Eshi's rescue were a blur of activity in Redemption Ridge. The townsfolk couldn't stop talking about what had happened, how she'd been taken, how Ezra had tracked her down, and how he'd single-handedly taken on 3 dangerous men to bring her back. Stories grew wilder with each retelling, some claiming Ezra had fought off an entire gang while others swore they'd seen him ride into town on a horse covered in dust and blood. None of it was true, of course, but Ezra didn't bother correcting them. Let the legends spread. It kept people at a distance, which was exactly how he liked it. For Eshi, though, the attention was overwhelming. She appreciated the concern from her neighbors, but their constant questions and lingering stares made it hard to focus on anything else. Every time she stepped outside, someone stopped her to ask if she was all right, or offer condolences for what she'd been through. It wasn't malicious. They genuinely cared, but it reminded her of the ordeal she was trying so desperately to put behind her. So she stayed indoors as much as possible, keeping the bookstore closed and focusing on small tasks to keep her mind occupied. Ezra noticed the toll it was taking on her. He could see it in the way she moved slower than usual, how her laughter no longer reached her eyes. Even when she smiled, there was something fragile about it, like it might crack at any moment. He wanted to say something, to tell her it was okay to feel broken after everything she'd endured, but words weren't his strength. Instead, he did what he knew best. He stayed by her side, quietly ensuring she never felt alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ezra found Eshi sitting on the porch steps outside the bookstore. She had a cup of tea in her hands, though it looked untouched and her gaze was fixed somewhere far away. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine from the nearby woods. Ezra hesitated for a moment, unsure if she wanted company, but then he grabbed a chair and sat beside her anyway. "You've been quiet today," he said, his voice low and steady. Eshi shrugged, not looking at him, just thinking. About what? She was silent for a long moment before finally speaking. About how much I hate feeling weak. Like I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, you know? Like I should have done more to fight back instead of just sitting there. Ezra frowned, leaning forward slightly. You survived, that's more than most people would have done. But surviving isn't enough, she countered, her voice tinged with frustration. I shouldn't have let them take me in the first place. If I'd been paying closer attention, if I hadn't taken that shortcut, I wouldn't have ended up in that cabin. Ezra sighed, running a hand over his face. You can't blame yourself for this. Those men chose to do what they did. It's not your fault. I know that, Eshi said quickly, though her tone suggested otherwise. But knowing it doesn't make it easier. I keep replaying it in my head, wondering what I could have done differently. Ezra studied her profile, noticing the tension in her jaw and the way her fingers tightened around the teacup. He wished he knew how to fix this, to take away the guilt and fear gnawing at her, but he wasn't good at comforting people. Still, he tried. You're stronger than you think, he said softly. You held your ground in that cabin even when you thought no one was coming for you. Most folks would have crumbled under that kind of pressure, but not you. You stood tall, even when they tried to break you. Eshi glanced at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. How do you know that? Because I know you, Ezra replied simply. And because I saw it myself. They didn't win, Eshi. No matter. What they didn't break you. His words hung in the air between them, heavy but somehow comforting. Eshi looked down at her hands, blinking rapidly as if trying to hold back tears. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. It still feels like they did. They didn't, Ezra insisted, his tone firm but gentle. Not really. You're here. You're alive. And you're tougher than anyone gives you credit for, including yourself. Eshi didn't respond right away. She stared at the ground, her thoughts swirling like storm clouds. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and nodded. Maybe you're right, she admitted. But it's going to take time to feel like myself again. That's okay, Ezra said. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She turned to look at him, searching his face for any trace of doubt but found none. For the first time in days, a genuine smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Promise? She asked, half joking but entirely serious. Ezra returned her smile, though his was smaller and more reserved. Promise. Later that night, after the stars had emerged to dot the sky, Ishi and Ezra sat inside the bookstore surrounded by stacks of books and the faint smell of old paper. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting warm light across the room. Ishi had reopened the shop earlier that day, eager to get back to some semblance of normalcy, but business had been slow. Most of the townsfolk were giving her space, respecting her need to heal without prying too much. Now, with the shop empty and the world outside quiet, they talked openly about things they'd never dared discuss before. Ezra shared stories from his past, about the places he'd traveled, the people he'd met, and the battles he'd fought. Some tales were lighthearted, making Eshe laugh until her sides hurt, while others were darker, revealing glimpses of the pain and loss he carried. With him, in turn, Eshe opened up about her own life, the struggles she'd faced growing up, the dreams she'd chased, and the reasons she'd chosen Redemption Ridge as her home. As they talked, something shifted between them. The unspoken bond they'd always shared began to solidify, becoming clearer and more defined. They weren't just two people brought together by chance anymore. They were partners, equals, bound by trust, respect, and a deep understanding of each other's scars. By the time they finally went to bed, exhausted but content, both felt lighter somehow. Talking had helped, even if neither of them realized it at first. Sharing their burdens, however briefly, had eased the weight pressing down on their shoulders. The next morning, Ishi woke up early, unable to sleep any longer. She dressed quickly and headed downstairs, surprised to find Ezra already awake and sipping coffee by the fireplace. He greeted her with a nod, offering her a steaming mug without saying a word. She accepted it gratefully, savoring the warmth as it spread through her chest. "We need to figure out who hired those men," Ezra said abruptly, breaking the peaceful silence. Eshe stiffened, setting her mug down on the table. "Do we have to talk about this now?" "Yes," Ezra replied firmly, "because whoever it was isn't going to stop. Not unless we make sure of it." Eshe sighed, rubbing her temples. "I don't even know where to start." "We don't have any leads, Ezra. Just a crumpled ransom note and a bunch of guesses." "We don't need much," he countered. "We follow the trail backward. Those men didn't act alone. They were hired guns. Someone paid them, and someone gave them orders. All we have to do is find that person." "And how do you suggest we do that?" Eshe asked, crossing her arms. "Knock on every door in Redemption Ridge and ask if they ordered a kidnapping recently." Ezra smirked, though his expression remained serious. "Something like that, but smarter. We start with the people who stand to gain the most from causing trouble in this town. There are only so many suspects." Eshe raised an eyebrow. "You really think it's someone local?" "It's always someone local," Ezra said grimly. "Outsiders don't care enough to stir up this kind of mess. This was personal." The realization hit Eshe like a punch to the gut. Personal. Whoever had orchestrated the kidnapping had targeted her specifically, not because of who she was, but because of who she represented. She glanced at Ezra, seeing the same thought reflected in his eyes. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about them, about the life they'd built together, however imperfect it might be. "So what's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the unease twisting in her stomach. Ezra stood up, grabbing his hat from the table. "We start asking questions, quietly, carefully, and we don't stop until we have our answers." Eshe nodded, rising to join him. "All right, let's do it." As they stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeting them, they exchanged a determined look. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as equals, as partners, and as survivors. Redemption Ridge might seem peaceful on the surface, but beneath its quiet exterior lurked secrets waiting to be uncovered. And Ezra and Eshe were ready to dig deep, no matter where the truth led them. The days that followed were a whirlwind of questions, suspicion, and quiet determination. Ezra and Eshe worked tirelessly to uncover the truth behind the kidnapping, piecing together clues like detectives in a mystery novel. They started with the obvious suspects, the people who had something to gain from stirring up trouble in Redemption Ridge. There was the owner of the saloon, a grizzled man known for his shady dealings, the local banker, whose greed often put him at odds with the townsfolk, and even the town's mayor, whose polished smile hid a reputation for cutting corners when it suited him. Each one denied any involvement, their voices dripping with fake innocence, but Ezra wasn't convinced. He knew better than to trust appearances. Men like these were experts at playing the part of respectable citizens while pulling strings behind the scenes. So instead of relying on their words, Ezra and Eshe focused on actions, small details that others might overlook. A ledger with suspicious entries, a wagon wheel coated in mud matching the dirt near the cabin where Eshe had been held, and whispered conversations overheard in dimly lit corners of the saloon. Bit by bit, the puzzle began to come together. Their investigation brought them closer to danger than either of them cared to admit. Late one night, as they pored over documents in the back room of the bookstore, someone knocked on the door. 3 sharp raps echoed through the stillness, sending a chill down Eshe's spine. Ezra motioned for her to stay quiet, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver holstered at his side. He moved silently to the door, peering through the crack before opening it. Standing outside was an old prospector, a wiry man with sunken eyes and a voice like gravel. "I heard you're looking for answers," he rasped, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "I got information, but it ain't free." Ezra narrowed his eyes. "What kind of information?" The prospector leaned closer, lowering his voice. "About the folks who hired those men, the ones who took your lady here." He jerked his thumb toward Eshe, who stood frozen in the shadows. "But if anyone finds out I talked to you..." He trailed off, leaving the threat unspoken. Ezra reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of coins. "This enough to loosen your tongue?" The prospector snatched the money greedily, stuffing it into his coat. "There's talk," he said quickly. "Talk about a deal gone bad. Someone wanted to send a message, to teach the town a lesson. And they thought taking her would do the trick." "Who?" Ezra pressed, his tone sharp. The prospector hesitated, fear flickering across his face. Finally, he muttered a name under his breath and disappeared into the night before either of them could ask another question. The name led them straight to the mayor's office. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to make Ezra and Eshe dig deeper. Over the next few days, they gathered evidence, forged letters, bribes paid in secret, and a trail of lies that pointed directly to the man in charge. The mayor had orchestrated the kidnapping not because of Eshe herself, but because of what she represented, a symbol of hope and stability in a town he wanted to control. By targeting her, he'd hoped to instill fear, to show everyone that no one was safe unless they played by his rules. When confronted, the mayor tried to deny everything, his polished facade crumbling under the weight of their accusations. But Ezra didn't give him the chance to squirm his way out of it. With cold precision, he laid out every piece of evidence, watching as the color drained from the mayor's face. In the end, there was nothing left for the man to do but confess. His cronies scattered like rats fleeing a sinking ship, leaving him alone to face the consequences. Justice came swiftly. The townsfolk rallied around Ezra and Eshe, outraged by the betrayal. The mayor was stripped of his title and banished from Redemption Ridge, never to return. As for the kidnappers, word spread quickly about what had happened to them, and what awaited anyone else foolish enough to try something similar. Ezra's reputation grew even larger, though he didn't care for the attention. All that mattered to him was that Eshe was safe. With the dust settled and peace restored, life in Redemption Ridge began to return to normal, or as close to normal as it ever got. Eshe reopened her bookstore fully, welcoming customers with a warmth that hadn't been there before. She still carried the scars of her ordeal, both visible and invisible, but she faced them head-on, refusing to let fear dictate her life. Ezra stayed by her side, helping however he could, though he kept mostly to himself when strangers were around. Their bond had grown stronger through the trials they'd endured, transforming into something neither of them could have predicted. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in fiery hues, Ezra and Eshi sat together on the porch steps of the bookstore. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. For once there was no tension between them, no lingering shadows of the past, just quiet contentment. "You know," Eshi said softly, breaking the silence, "I used to think this place was just a stop along the way, somewhere to catch my breath before moving on." "And now?" Ezra asked, glancing at her. "Now I think maybe it's home," she replied, smiling faintly. "Not because of the town itself, but because of the people in it. Because of you." Ezra didn't respond right away. He looked out at the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "Home isn't always a place," he said finally. "Sometimes it's just someone." Eshi turned to look at him, her heart swelling with gratitude and something deeper she couldn't quite put into words. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." Ezra nodded, his lips curving into the smallest of smiles. "You don't have to thank me. Not anymore." They sat there for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one. In the vast expanse above, Redemption Ridge stretched out before them, quiet and peaceful under the watchful eye of the night. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was theirs. Together, they had weathered storms, faced dangers, and emerged stronger than ever. And, as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying promises of new beginnings, Ezra and Eshi knew one thing for certain. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. Not as victims of circumstance, but as survivors, as partners, as family. Because sometimes, in a world full of chaos and uncertainty, love is the only thing that truly redeems us.